welcome back. So new banner, new fodder, well mostly new fodder with some variants of pre-existing fodder. I was debating on whether or not I should bother making this one because a majority of it is either really niche or just really mediocre. But seeing as this video is live, I guess you know what decision I came to. As such, we're going to be going over the 4 brand new units that we got on the Awakening banner, go over their brand new skills or at least some of the notable variants, and just give an idea of how you'd probably want to use them if you do decide to fodder any of these off for any reason. As such, we may as well just get right into it, starting with Gregor. I was initially going to go in order with Arcane Robin, but I did make a whole video about their inheritable breath, so if you do want to see that in particular, I would recommend just going down to the video in the description if you want to see it there. If not, Phoenix Master, Oblivion Knight, Theology, they've all done really good videos on this as well. If you are interested, I always find that having more perspectives on anything is always a good thing, but regardless, Gregor came into the game with Solid Ground 4, where it grants 7 attack and defense visibly, but it inflicts -5 res. And for the most part, you would kind of look at this and scratch your head as to where you would want to use this, because usually you would use these types of skills for tanks in particular, because more often than not, you're usually stacking up attack and defense if the goal is to take on melee threats, because the majority of them do take on defense. But we do have other skills in the game that don't come at the cost of any res stat and provide additional effects. So the question really becomes, where do you want to use Solid Ground at all? In my opinion, using Solid Ground on any support unit is probably going to be some of the best things you can do, especially when you pair it up with far save or even near save armors. Because with Solid Ground 4, you'll be able to soak stuff like chill attack defense, meaning that general tanking prowess goes through the roof when it comes to armors in particular. Because when it comes to just tanking in general with far saves or even near saves, the goal is to live. And if you are getting debuffed to your defense, then your longevity is definitely going to suffer as a result, whether that's from AoEs or that's just from dealing more damage in combat. And as a result, I do think if you were to put Solid Ground on any sort of unit, you would want to put it on support units that already have a naturally high attack and defense stat, so that way they can soak stuff like chill attack and defense. So for example, I have Flame Moosebow here and a Kagel. A +10 Kagel with max flowers can still dodge any sort of chill attack and defense debuff if you're running a Flame Moosebow, for example, with Solid Ground 4, because he ends up getting a way bigger stat total, which is really, really nice. This doesn't even have to be Moosebow, for example. It could also be units like Legendary Hector or anybody else that has a good attack and defense stat. And for armors in particular, as long as they aren't overreaching in terms of their overall attack and defense, then they're going to be able to tank a lot better, which is really, really convenient. Granted, the support unit that you do use is going to vary because you don't really want to pair some units with other ones, but you would want to keep it in mind for future usage because, again, removing any sort of attack and defense debuff for any of your tanks is always going to be a net positive. And that's as far as it goes when it comes to armors in particular. You could also put it on specific units such as Mila, Eldigan, and Mordecai. Mila and Eldigan are pretty straightforward. You want to stack as much defense as humanly possible. Mila so she can inflict isolation, and Eldigan so he can dodge isolation, which will be really, really nice. And Mordecai inflicts a huge stat swing based on his visible defense, and as a result, having more visible defense for him is going to be doing a lot better in the long run, especially since now you don't have to dump his attack stat for Fortress Defense res, and his res isn't exactly the best as is, so being able to prioritize the stats you want is nice. Outside of that, you can still use this on any sort of Flame Gunbai user or Winter Rapier user. Flame Gunbai, it still follows the same trend as Flame Mordecai. You stack up a bunch of visible attack and defense, so that way you can inflict a bunch of penalties from Flame Gunbai, which is pretty nice. And Winter Rapier is going to be a bit more gimmicky because it does heavily rely on getting debuffed, because otherwise it's basically just a generic sword, and at that point you may as well just use an Arcane or Coral Saber or anything else. But point being is that if you can get the debuffs, then Winter Rapier is going to go off, and you're more than likely going to get it going if you have a higher attack and defense total, and that's what Solid Ground is there to do. However, there are way more consistent builds that you can use instead of Winter Rapier Solid Ground, but it's food for thought nonetheless. Next we have Arcane Robin, and I do go over her breath in a separate video, so if you want to see that, link in the description. I'll also link a bunch of other ones that I thought were pretty good. We're mainly going to be looking at attack speed near save, and this is just another variant of saves. There's really nothing new about it outside of it just granting speed, which is nice, But in terms of just overall practical usage, it's going to remain the same as ever. So you really just want to put this on fast near save users. So for example, Winter Manuela is a really fantastic near save, not only because of the Arcane Sword, but now because of attack speed near save. She'll be able to dodge stuff like Legendary Nana, which will be really, really good for just overall tanking prowess and just survivability, because if you could just shrug off whatever damage that you're taking, especially from threats that can just pierce through stuff like Pavis, then you're going to be way better for it in the long run. And the same thing can really be applied to Valentine's Lucina as well. She does have her own set of gimmicks with her own PRF and Future Vision, but for the most part it's pretty much the same. You stack attack and speed and yada 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 yada. You're basically doing the same thing. There's not really much else to say on the skill, it's just attack and speed and near save. But in terms of just notable candidates, you also just have stuff like Picnic Felicia, who also has a really good speed stat, Valentine's Ike, who could do the same thing as Winter Manuela, Amelia. You could probably switch out her PRF for Seahorse Axe if you would much rather get the guaranteed follow-up, but you would be giving up the slaying effect, meaning that her damage reduction properties from Hardy Fighter would be significantly less. You could also use it on Black Knight or Black Luna proc, so his damage output is just significantly higher. One of the few things that a lot of people have argued with Black Knight and Zelgius in particular is that maybe they don't have enough speed to take advantage of the likes of Savvy Fighter. So now with attack speed near save, they'll be a lot more consistent, which is really nice. You can also give it to someone like Winter Sophis, who also just recently got the Arcane Grima weapon, which is pretty good. She'll get a bunch of stats, a guaranteed follow-up, and she has a lot of speed. And while the set isn't going to be nearly as good as someone like Arcane Robin, you can still mimic a good amount of its performance from it, because you can run Savalin Shield and then all that stuff, and she still has the guaranteed follow-up, which is really good. You could also put it on Fallen Young Tiki, because she does have the follow-up prevention, and with Hardy Fighter, the only way you're going to be able to double her is with no follow-up and a good speed stat. And that's going to be really, really difficult to do, especially if she is running attack speed near save, because doubling her is just going to be really difficult overall. And then Zelgius pretty much just follows the same route as Black Knight. Really not much else to say on there, they're literally the same unit. Then we have Phila, who doesn't really have anything outside of Rain Lance. Pegasus Flight is not really a good skill, even though you can still put it on units such as Sheeta and Claire. I absolutely do not recommend putting this skill on any unit, because at this point you may as well just run something like Trace or Flows, especially something like Flow Feather. But regardless, Pegasus Flight really just isn't a good skill overall, and I wouldn't really recommend foddering her for that. The only thing really worth discussing with Phila is the Rain Lance, because you can actually use this in a fair amount of ways, whether that's with support or general stat stacking. Flyer support and infantry support in particular, especially if you were to either use this in the save ball or bulwarks, you can actually just provide a good amount of stat swings with attack speed Rain in the Rain Lance. For example, with flyer support, you park them right behind a bulwark or melee specialist, and you'll be able to inflict a good amount of debuffs from the weapon and Seesaw alone, and you can continue to stack up HP, or potentially run double life and death so they can also soak attack and speed for you. As we have in the build with Geese, he can instead run something like even Pulse Tie or even Ruses, because Flyers can't use Ruses. So there is a trade-off for each and every one of them. If you are going to be using a support unit that just isn't out of pure bias, you could always just use literally anybody who has a weapon dedicated to support and with a bigger range, such as Kinshi Knight Hinoka. That being said though, it's still a demote land, so if you did want to use it on any sort of speedy generic unit, you could absolutely do that, because it's still -5 speed and defense on the foe during combat, which is perfectly fine. You're not getting any additional effects, but it's just there. You're just getting extra stats. So for what it's worth, it's a fine weapon, but if you're not really going to be using it for supportive purposes, you probably have better options readily available to you. And finally, we have Ascended Heir, who also has a really niche beast skill. Attack speed catch is pretty straightforward. You can't get both, unfortunately, so we're really just going to be covering Mystic Boost 4. But I don't think anyone's really struggling to figure out who to put attack speed catch for on anyway, because it's really just good for any speedy cav and flyer. As such, we'll really just talk about Mystic Boost 4 for a second, because there's really also not much to talk about here. In terms of practical usage, outside of someone like Brave Seliph and maybe some infantry speed tanks, you're probably not going to get too much mileage out of this skill. Brave Seliph in particular is really solid with this, because it now heals 10 HP after combat, meaning that he could consistently keep his miracle active as long as he's able to heal after combat, without the need for double Mystic Boost, which is really, really convenient. Meanwhile, if you can run any sort of infantry speed tank with maybe something like Godlike Reflexes, then Mystic Boost 4 will actually provide a good amount of usage. You can still run something with the likes of Null Sea Disrupt instead, but because Mystic Boost does provide Null Sea Disrupt against staves, which is definitely going to be one of the more prominent fire sweep effects on something like Aetherite's Defense, it's actually a really good trade-off because you also get healing after combat, meaning that units like Rutger can continue to keep their sustainability active, which is really, really nice. Outside of that, you could potentially put this on some far save armors. I don't really think it's a great idea, but I think there may be some potential there, because you could still be fighting against Dazzling Staff units. So if you do have a weapon that can provide a guaranteed follow-up, or you're that confident in their ability to tank anyway, maybe it's worth the trade-off, but chances are you're much better off with something like Hardy Fighter or even Savvy Fighter. Really, this is probably going to be one of the most niche skills that we currently have in the game. I would argue it's probably more niche than Chill Defense Res, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless, there really isn't much to the skill either. It just has Null Sea Disrupt against staves, it has 10 HP after combat, and it inflicts -5 attack on the foe during combat, which, again, can still be really good for general tanking, or especially for Brave Self's case, where it's more than likely he won't get shot down all the way to 1 HP, because he will get the debuff on the foe. But it's still okay for what it is. And in terms of the rest of the banner when it comes to fodder, there's really nothing else. I would argue this is probably one of the weakest banners that we got when it comes to fodder. Even when you take the arcane weapon into account, a lot of dragons just already have a good PRF already that you probably don't even want to replace arcane with. But outside of that, unless you really like the units, or some of the units are just really, really good combat or supportively, I really wouldn't recommend pulling on it, especially for the fodder. But you have to let me know what you think down below. I don't think anybody's really going to be foddering anybody off in particular, but if you are, let me know to who, because I am genuinely curious. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.